There are times when a simple video capture can become something much bigger than the image it captures. In the case of a recent event that occurred outside Jerusalem, an amateur video recorded by a local resident ended up quietly circulating among religious groups, academics, and curious people around the world. What it shows is not just a fire, but something that seems to defy both scientific logic and spiritual neutrality. The flames that rose from the ground that day formed improbable and eerily precise patterns. This was no ordinary spread. The fire seemed to have direction, intent, and, according to many who were present, a message. The question that remains is simple: can fire speak? The answer is uncomfortable, especially for those who prefer traditional explanations. But those who witnessed what happened that afternoon can safely say that it was not just a weather phenomenon. Throughout history, humanity has always sought to understand the signs of the sky, the tremors of the earth, the whispers of the wind, and above all, the meaning of the flames that rise with fury. Whether in the burning bush of Moses, in the columns of fire in the desert, or in the visions of the prophets, fire occupies a special place in the construction of the sacred. It both purifies and consumes. It both reveals and silences. And it was precisely this duality that many reported feeling when observing that flaming whirlwind that suddenly appeared in one of the regions most charged with spiritual meaning in the world. The visual record shows a vortex of fire rising violently, while debris is thrown in concentric circles. None of this would be particularly unusual in areas prone to wildfires, except for one detail that is hard to ignore: the way the fire behaved. It did not expand chaotically. Instead, it seemed to draw. Some witnesses claimed that, for brief moments, letters in ancient Hebrew could be seen amid the flames. Others said they heard a low, distant sound, similar to the blast of a shofar. Even meteorological experts who analyzed the images hesitated to classify it as a simple atmospheric phenomenon. Temperatures that day were high, but not out of the ordinary for the region. Winds were strong, but not unpredictable. Still, what formed was something extremely rare, a conjunction of climatic factors that, in the reading of many, goes beyond the bounds of coincidence. What makes the episode even more provocative is the context in which it occurred. It wasn't just anywhere. The affected area includes historical sites related to biblical accounts that speak of divine judgments, encounters with the sacred and spiritual conflicts. The vicinity of the Kidron Valley, the slopes of the Mount of Olives, the proximity to the Garden of Gethsemane, and even ancient trails mentioned in religious texts were the scene of the fire's passage. The flames, according to several reports, seemed to go around certain places, following an invisible path, as if following an unwritten script. Some say it was not just a fire, but an event that simultaneously touched on the natural, the historical, and the prophetic. The most curious thing, however, was the reaction of the authorities. Silence. No official statement was issued explaining the details of the phenomenon, nor was there a press conference with meteorologists or security experts. Press coverage was limited to brief notes, with little or no in-depth analysis. At the same time, videos published on social media were being deleted with unusual speed. Users reported loss of access, unexplained complaints, and suspension of accounts. This led many to believe that something else was being deliberately ignored or even hidden. For those who prefer to believe in rational explanations, this deletion can be attributed to the flow of misinformation common in panic situations. For others, it is precisely the lack of transparency that indicates the gravity of what happened. Based on these elements, the case ceased to be just a local report. It began to be discussed by scholars of comparative religions, researchers of extreme atmospheric phenomena, and spiritual leaders from different traditions. What unites these voices, so distinct from each other, is the perception that something important happened there, something that touches on deep dimensions of human existence, especially with regard to the idea of signs, revelation, and hidden purpose. It is not about convincing the skeptic or feeding the credulous. It is about seriously reporting what was seen, felt, and recorded, and opening space for each person to make their own interpretation based on evidence, ancient texts, and, mainly, on the questions that arise when the inexplicable imposes itself on what seemed known. Thus, we are not just faced with a curious phenomenon, but with a symbolic milestone that invites us to listen and discern. After all, If there is a language of the sacred that manifests itself through fire, it does not begin with answers, but with a question that echoes in the heart of those who observe. What exactly was shown to us that day? This question, more than any other, is the starting point of a journey that goes beyond the realm of the visible and penetrates the most ancient layers of what is called faith. From that moment on, what lies before us is the possibility of interpreting the event not as an accident, but as part of something greater, a narrative that involves not only Jerusalem, but the human condition itself in the face of mystery. The images that emerged after the phenomenon did not just cause astonishment. For many, they awakened ancestral memories, sacred references, and a feeling that something invisible was revealed through fire. In many traditions, flames have always been more than a physical element. They are a sign of presence, a manifestation of will, a channel between the human and the divine. Over the centuries, different peoples have attributed profound meanings to fire, especially when it gets out of control and seems to appear with a precision that defies natural explanations. In the Hebrew tradition, there are ancient records that associate fire with the moment when God communicates with his chosen ones. When Moses came across a bush that was burning without being consumed, he realized that he was not in front of an ordinary fire. There began one of the most emblematic narratives of the Jewish faith, in which the divine call is manifested through flames. The word Moses used when responding to the presence was Hineni, which means "here I am." This same word was mentioned by other biblical figures in similar contexts, such as Abraham and Isaiah, always faced with missions that required courage and total dedication. In the recent episode that occurred in Jerusalem, the symbolic similarity is impossible to ignore. Witnesses report that among the flames it was possible to see, albeit for brief moments, the formation of letters similar to those of the Hebrew alphabet. The most recurrent, according to reports, was precisely the one that forms the term Hineni. The place where the fire manifested itself with greatest intensity also has spiritual resonance. Records indicate that the central focus arose in the vicinity of the Kidron Valley, a region mentioned in the book of the prophet Joel as the place where the nations would be judged. This text, dated approximately 7 centuries before the Christian era, describes the appearance of signs in the heavens and on earth, including blood, fire, and columns of smoke, preceding the day of the Lord. These parallels have caught the attention of not only religious people, but also scholars who dedicate their lives to understanding ancient texts. Among them, there are those who find even deeper links between the event and scriptures considered apocryphal, such as the Book of Baruch. Preserved by some traditions and ignored by others, this text contains passages that speak of a flame that comes out of the holy city and speaks with the voice of bodies that no longer breathe. The fire, according to this description, does not destroy that which is sacred, but consumes its surroundings, purifying the surroundings of invisible impurities. Reports from local residents and pilgrims seem to echo this idea. Many have stated that objects of historical or religious value remained intact, even in areas that were completely devastated. The description of a selective fire that bypasses certain points, preserving them while consuming the rest, is not common in records of natural disasters. In common cases of forest fires, the spread occurs based on vegetation, topography, and wind. There is no symbolic direction, nor is there respect for fixed trajectories. However, what was seen in Jerusalem escapes this predictability. Some sites historically associated with faith remained undamaged. Testimonies from archaeologists who investigated the area shortly after the event confirm that ancient artifacts, many of which were fragile and exposed, were not touched by the flames. Modern structures, made of concrete and metal, were partially or completely destroyed. This type of occurrence awakens in many the feeling that something is being communicated behind the destructive appearance of fire. In the Bible, there are numerous references to the use of flames as a way of transmitting divine messages. The prophet Elijah, for example, had his life ended not by death, but by a chariot of fire that took him to heaven. In the book of Ezekiel, the vision of a divine structure composed of wheels and incandescent energy is described as a meeting between the visible and the eternal. This type of symbolic language is recurrent in prophetic and apocalyptic contexts, where fire represents both judgment and preparation for something greater. Based on local reports, some of the manifestations that occurred during the fire go beyond the visible. These include unidentified sounds, unexplained interference in electronic equipment, and even an unusual atmosphere that meteorologists perceived as being outside of known standards. Electromagnetic recordings captured by instruments in the region showed levels normally associated with phenomena of unconventional origin. This information was initially considered irrelevant, but it began to be revisited in light of the number of reports that emerged in succession. At the same time, the absence of flames in certain buildings and the integrity of sensitive materials amid the destruction increase curiosity about the limits between what can be explained and what can only be recognized. In this context, it is not just a natural event with an emotional impact. There is a symbolic composition being formed between the place, the date, the way everything developed, and the spiritual meanings attributed to the manifestations. In this scenario, fire is not only something that destroys, it acts as a revealer, bringing to the surface issues that were hidden or forgotten. In a world saturated with information and skepticism, a phenomenon like this has the power to break through layers of indifference and point to something that cannot be reduced to technical causes. The prophetic interpretation, although not accepted by everyone, finds in this event a fertile field for deep reflection on the relationship between what is seen and what is intuited, between the present and what seems to have been announced long ago. If this content is making sense to you, leave an Amen in the comments. It's a simple way to show that you're following and connecting with this message. Let's see how many people are feeling the same. As reports of the phenomenon in Jerusalem began to circulate more intensely, reports emerged from different parts of the city, from people who did not even know each other and who, in many cases, belonged to different religious traditions. This plurality of testimonies quickly attracted attention not only because of the similarity of the details described, but also because of the way in which a localized and apparently isolated physical event began to awaken spiritual reactions of great intensity among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. At the heart of this convergence is the idea that the manifestations that occurred were not merely environmental, but spiritual. And more than that, what was seen and felt that day points to something announced in the sacred scriptures of each of these traditions. A rabbi, who was near the Western Wall, declared that he had seen among the columns of smoke the image of the Merkabah, the celestial chariot mentioned in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. This symbolic structure, described as composed of wheels within wheels and surrounded by fire and winged creatures, represents a direct manifestation of the divine presence. For him, that moment surpassed any theological reading. It was a personal experience of transcendence that changed the way he understood the texts he had been studying for decades. At the same time, a Christian pilgrim who had come from Europe to visit the city's holy sites filmed what he described as figures that resembled angels with trumpets, as described in the Book of Revelation. In his speech, he reported feeling an atmosphere of spiritual urgency, as if what was before his eyes was not just a visual phenomenon, but a summons. This sense of calling and alarm was also mentioned by a Muslim businessman who claimed to have witnessed the formation of symbols similar to ancient Arabic characters in the flames, evoking verses from the Quran related to the end of times. According to him, these were not metaphors, but rather a visual warning rooted in the texts he had known since childhood. This harmony between testimonies from religions with such distinct trajectories is not common, especially when the reports emerge spontaneously and without prior coordination between those involved. What we saw was a convergence of spiritual interpretations that, despite being based on different doctrines, pointed to the same essential meaning, that something greater was manifesting itself through that fire, something that transcended immediate explanations and required urgent attention. These reports were recorded in videos, interviews, and public comments before many of them were deleted or withdrawn from circulation without clear explanations. The shared perception of a divine sign reflects an expectation that runs through the three Abrahamic traditions, that the end times will not arrive silently, but will be accompanied by visible and unmistakable signs. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all carry prophecies that mention the presence of fire as one of the elements that will mark this transition. In Judaism, there is an expectation that, before the coming of the Messiah, the earth and the sky will bring visible warnings to the people of Israel. In Christianity, the Book of John describes the appearance of intense natural phenomena, including columns of smoke and fire, as part of the announcement of the final judgment. In Islam, eschatology includes the presence of heavenly and earthly signs, among which fire plays a central role in the purification and revelation of what was hidden. This direct connection to Scripture is not just symbolic. In many of the texts cited by religious leaders during the days following the phenomenon, there are specific references to events in Jerusalem, the temple surroundings, and manifestations that would occur simultaneously in heaven and on earth. A striking example is in the Damascus document, a manuscript associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which describes a time when the enemies of the Holy City would gather against it, and fire would come from both the ground and the heights, forming letters understandable only to those with discernment. This description accurately approximates what was reported by multiple observers in the vicinity of Jerusalem that day. Furthermore, the impact of the event was not limited to religious circles. Scholars in comparative religion have begun to analyze how the three great Abrahamic traditions interpreted the same event with different languages but nearly identical messages. For some scholars, this represents a rare opportunity to observe how universal symbols can emerge from a specific context, uniting distinct spiritualities around a common reading of the sacred. The idea that the divine speaks through nature, history, and unusual events is not new, but its reappearance in a setting as loaded with meaning as Jerusalem creates a convergence that goes beyond the limits of individual interpretation. The articulation of these testimonies reinforces the perception that the event has a dual nature. It is, at the same time, physical and spiritual. In this sense, fire comes to represent a threshold, a transition point between what is visible and what is being prepared. It is not only a destructive force, but a marker of cycles, a sign that significant changes are underway. And when this type of sign is recognized by voices that, historically, have walked parallel paths, but have rarely crossed paths in harmony, a rare possibility of a common reading arises. A collective recognition that something extraordinary, even if shrouded in mystery, is underway. When one looks at the broader context of what happened in Jerusalem, it becomes inevitable to consider the historical and calendar milestones surrounding the event. What at first glance seems like an isolated episode takes on deeper contours when analyzed from the perspective of sacred time, religious cycles, and the memories that the city carries in its stones. Jerusalem is not just a city of geopolitical relevance. It is, for many, the axis between the earthly and the eternal, where dates, places, and symbols are not just part of culture, but part of revelation. The day the fire raged coincides with a very important moment in the Hebrew calendar. It was on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz that, according to historical records and rabbinical texts, the walls of Jerusalem were breached before the destruction of the First Temple in the mid-6th century BCE. This day marks the beginning of a period of mourning and reflection known as the 3 weeks, which culminates on the 9th day of Av, the date that commemorates the destruction of the city's 2 temples. The repetition of these milestones throughout history is not seen as a coincidence. Many consider these moments to form a pattern that links human actions to divine responses. The presence of fire on this date suggests, for those who follow sacred cycles, a connection between past and present. More than a simple coincidence of the calendar, some see this as an echo of ancient warnings described in Scripture. The Book of Lamentations, for example, associated with the same period of mourning, describes Jerusalem's suffering in the face of destruction and abandonment. Words that, for many, sound like mirrors of what was witnessed in those hours when the flames seemed to whisper ancient meanings around the city. In addition to the chronological dimension, there is also the astronomical aspect. The date of the fire occurs 5 days after a celestial conjunction that has been studied by observers attentive to the biblical symbolism of the heavens. This configuration has been compared by some scholars to the scene described in the Book of Revelation, where a woman appears clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. This image, which represents the fulfillment of a prophetic sign, had already been associated with a specific alignment that occurred in September of the year 2017. Now, with the repetition of celestial elements and manifestations on earth, the parallels gain new momentum. Within Judaism, there is also the concept of the Shemitah, a 7-year cycle that organizes the nation's agricultural and spiritual time. This cycle dictates that the land must rest every 7 years, offering not only rest to the soil, but also reflection to the community. Tradition holds that the 7th year carries greater symbolic weight, where significant events usually manifest. According to rabbinical calculations, the year in which the phenomenon occurred corresponds exactly to a Shemitah year, which for many further expands the scope of the event. These time markers, both those related to the ground and the sky, are fundamental to the spiritual reading of events. They are not just dates on the calendar, but symbolic windows in which the connection between the divine and the human seems to intensify. Within this logic, the events that occur in these windows are interpreted as revelations, warnings, or invitations to inner transformation. Thus, the fire that occurred is not seen simply as something to be explained, but as a sign to be deciphered. In historical terms, the place where the fire hit with greatest intensity also draws attention for its symbolic meaning. The path followed by the flames was traced, by several observers, as similar to the path that Jesus of Nazareth would have taken between Gethsemane and Golgotha. This overlap of routes did not go unnoticed. For Christian theologians, this is a clear reference to the path of sacrifice, surrender, and victory over death. For scholars of religious symbolism, it is yet another example of how material elements can be used to express spiritual truths that span the centuries. There is also a question that is frequently raised by archaeologists and experts in ancient history. Many artifacts and structures of historical importance, especially those linked to the Second Temple period, remained intact. In contrast, modern buildings, built with more resistant materials, were partially or completely consumed. This selectivity of destruction does not align with known patterns of fire propagation, reinforcing the perception that there is something unusual about the way the phenomenon behaved. For many, it is a silent but powerful sign that the present time is intrinsically connected to ancient times, and that what we are experiencing now is, in some way, a continuation of stories that have already been told, even if they are not fully understood. Looking back at the writings of prophets and sages of ancient times, it is not difficult to find texts that speak of fire as a messenger. In different eras, men and women have turned to these writings in times of crisis, seeking guidance. And now, in the face of such a singular manifestation, we turn to these texts not as a mere curiosity, but as a living source of interpretation, where the past illuminates the present and points to possibilities still shrouded by the veil of time. Even after reports of the event in Jerusalem spread, little was done officially to clarify the most intriguing details. The information released by local authorities was limited to technical aspects of fire containment, without any mention of the singularities observed by residents and pilgrims. This lack of explanations fueled a widespread feeling of negligence or omission. After all, a phenomenon with such repercussions, occurring in a territory of such evident historical and spiritual importance, would hardly go unnoticed without reason. The scientific community, in turn, was cautious. Meteorologists spoke of the possibility of a flaming whirlwind, a rare and still poorly understood phenomenon. This type of occurrence requires specific conditions: intense heat, low humidity, and vertically moving air currents. Even so, many professionals consulted avoided stating with certainty that the recorded event fully fit this pattern. The lack of in-depth investigation into the properties of fire, its selective behavior, and the supposed formation of symbolic patterns ended up reinforcing the perception that there were more questions than answers. Meanwhile, the traditional media dealt with the issue briefly and superficially. The reports that were broadcast limited themselves to mentioning the existence of an unusual fire, without exploring the symbolic elements or the impacts reported by those who were present. No broadcaster conducted an in-depth investigation, nor did they seek to hear from theologians, archaeologists, or religious scholars to contextualize the phenomenon within a broader perspective. This lack of journalistic curiosity caused surprise. In other circumstances, events with less spiritual repercussions have already been widely analyzed. This time, the timid coverage seemed disproportionate to the narrative potential of the case. Social media initially served as the main channel for disseminating videos and testimonies. However, user reports indicate that many of these publications were removed without clear warning. In some cases, profiles were suspended under generic justifications. This pattern of automatic deletion, applied to content related to the same event, raised suspicions about the possibility of excessive or targeted moderation. Although it cannot be said with certainty that there was intentional censorship, the speed with which certain materials disappeared contributed to strengthening perceptions of concealment. This communication gap has given rise to speculation. Among those who delve deeper into the religious meanings of the event, the lack of an institutional response only reinforced the idea that something significant was being ignored or minimized. Among the more skeptical, concern arose about the way information of public interest is being managed in digital and news environments. The result was the same: distrust. When an experience lived by several individuals in a place of great importance finds no echo in official spheres, informal narrative takes the place of formal explanation. On the other hand, it is also possible that the silence of the press and science reflects the complexity of the phenomenon. Not everything can be explained immediately, and certain events require time, reliable data, and a willingness to deal with what is not fully understood. Even so, the lack of initiative in seeking these answers weakens the credibility of institutions before an increasingly attentive public. In times of information overload, the information void is quickly filled by alternative versions, often without filtering or verification. The case of Jerusalem highlights a sensitive point. When science and the media fail to provide even minimally robust explanations, they lose the chance to conduct public dialogue responsibly. In this case, the silence was not neutral. It served as fuel for different interpretations, which are based on the very lack of positioning. This does not mean that all interpretations are correct, but rather that the lack of transparency and open debate created an environment conducive to the multiplication of hypotheses. What remains for many is the impression that a real event, loaded with symbolism, was treated with coldness or disinterest by the institutions that should have led the process of clarification. And this perception can be more dangerous than the phenomenon itself, as it undermines trust in the structures of knowledge and communication. At a time when discernment is essential, silence becomes a noise that is difficult to ignore. Even in the face of prolonged silence from institutions and the lack of conclusive explanations, what happened in Jerusalem has not disappeared from collective memory. What many witnessed still provokes reflections, not only about the nature of the phenomenon itself, but about the way we react to what escapes us. The flames, with their unusual movements and symbolic impact, left marks that were not limited to the charred ground. They crossed the barriers of immediate reason and reached regions of consciousness where logic gives way to intuition. The most striking thing was the feeling that something had been broken, as if ordinary time had been interrupted by an event that requires listening and discernment. It is not just about interpreting signs, but about recognizing that, at certain moments, there are experiences that defy explanation and open up deeper questions. Not everything can be immediately understood or explained by pre-existing models. There are situations in which the answer is not presented in a rational way, but is insinuated in silences, gestures, and symbols. The episode revealed not only the fragility of our information structures, but also the strength of that which touches the invisible. In a world saturated by quick certainties and automatic explanations, the appearance of something that demands pause, contemplation, and care provokes a rare type of discomfort, the discomfort of not knowing. And maybe that discomfort is necessary. It forces us to step beyond the surface and consider that there are dimensions of reality that are not subject to the usual filters of perception. What remains after this event is not a closed conclusion, but an open field for reflection. Interpretations vary depending on the viewer's perspective. For some, it was a clear sign, full of spiritual meanings. For others, a misinterpreted natural phenomenon. However, there is a point of convergence between both sides, the certainty that the episode did not go unnoticed and that it caused, even if only for a moment, a suspension of normality. When events like this occur, they do not need campaigns, announcements, or official validation to exert influence. They resonate because they touch something essential. And the essential, by definition, does not impose itself through force, but through depth. In this case, it was the fire that spoke, but not with words. It spoke through images, movements, and silences that continue to pulse in the memories of those who were there and in the curiosity of those who merely observed from a distance. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.